still working. I'm going to be in Zambia this Monday.
Oh, excellent. Prepare for that. Folks, welcome back to Chris Wyatt Reports. This is Chris live in, sorry to say Santa, but in Pretoria, actually, in Brooklyn, with the Ukrainian ambassador to South Africa, Ambassador I always get it wrong, Abramatova. Did I get it correct?
Almost.
Almost. Sorry for that. I've been butchering names all week. It's my apologies. Well, it's good to see you in person.
Good to see you too.
Last time we spoke, it wasn't too long after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you were dealing with all the challenges of that. Of course, as a representative for Ukraine here in South Africa, you work within the diplomatic community with other countries. How is that progressing? Are countries still showing support here in South Africa for Ukraine?
Well, the people of South Africa are showing more and more awareness. And I think it's not only due to our proactive actions and the actions of all the diplomatic community, but also because of the consequences of the invasion. And people felt, as we say, on their skin, that being that far, that conflict brings them a lot of discomfort, and not only. And I think that they start to find out what is the reason behind this.
Well, the last time we talked, we spent a lot of time talking about the conflict and a bit about the history of Ukraine. And you said we should talk more about promoting Ukraine, talking about Ukraine. So I maybe a chance to do that today. I thought we'd take a little bit of time doing that. So a lot of people, if you show them a map around the world, I suspect they have a hard time finding Ukraine. But some people have a hard time
6
finding.
months ago, even.
Yeah. Well, maybe now it's not quite what is difficult, but I mean, a lot of people don't know the history of Ukraine. They don't know some of the attractions of it and something about the people. So if you share a little bit from your experience with us about Ukraine, why people might, let's pretend there's no war today, okay? There's no war, it's all over, it never happened. And if this was a year ago, and you're saying you're in South Africa, you're obviously promoting Ukraine trade with South Africa, you're also probably promoting folks coming to Ukraine. So what would you tell folks? Why come to Ukraine? What's it all about?
In South Africa, it would be very easy to speak about it because South Africa, A, the rainbow nation, and B, it has got all the natural resources for tourism that one can admire, as two oceans, as mountains, as deserts, and that's exactly the same that Ukraine has. So
Ukraine
we
has
don't
deserts?
have, of course, and
Oh, okay.
moreover, we don't have oceans, obviously, but we have two seas,
Yes.
and we have mountains, and the landscape is very diverse. The country is 2 times smaller than South Africa, exactly 2 times smaller.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Okay.
You never realize that when you look at the map, because African map was drawn.
Oh, the Mercator projection, yes.
Yeah.
If you look at the Peters projection, which is a German cartographer, it's very different. Africa is much longer and bigger. I remember as a child looking at those maps and you see Greenland. And I always, when we learned what the continents were, I said, why isn't Greenland a continent? It's so large. It's not really that large. It's just the way it was spread out in the map. It's much smaller.
Exactly. But Ukraine is the biggest country of Europe, meantime. So it's bigger than France or bigger than Spain. I would say that the thing that would attract any tourists to come to Ukraine is obviously our history, because the country is very old. It's was baptized in 988, and we have a lot of historical monuments and churches and castles that are that long, that old as 500 years. So it attracts a lot of people. What today our people coming back to the current situation and to the invasion and to this missile attacks when Russia is bombing those cultural sites, what was very noticeable when Ukrainians were putting special bandages or trying to cover all those
to protect those monuments. That is very sad to hear, but it's interesting you mentioned 988 because Iceland became Christian in the year 1000. That's a very memorable date. So Ukraine beat the Icelanders by about 12 years.
Yeah, so we have very interesting story of democracy. We were the country who first ever had a constitution in that form that exists today in general international law in 1701. That fight was. So Ukraine was during the history under different empires and partly was belonging to that or another country, but the struggle for independence and struggle for self-determination was always there, and that's why for us maybe this invasion is kind of culmination.
Well, as a historian, I've always found the geographic location of Ukraine fascinating, and the fact that it's located where it is made it a crossroads of some respects, not just of the Asian occupation side. I mean, the Golden Horde came through there, the Magyars came through and settled Hungary through there. You've got the Swedes coming down, they fought a battle of Poltava, all these different things happening. Under Charles the 12th, I think it was Charles the 12th, when Sweden was a major empire. You've had, of course, Russians coming through there, Cossacks coming through there. It's
crossroads of
Poland,
civilizations.
yes. It's definitely a crossroad of civilization. The Byzantines were also floating around in there. So the borders of what people have called Ukraine have changed over time. But the Ukrainian people live in a specific place. They occupy the space that is Ukraine today. But the east or the western portion for a period of time was occupied by Poland for a long period of time, and the eastern portion by Russia and the Soviet Union. So the Ukrainian people must be very resilient to retain their culture, their language, their identity, despite all these challenges over the last 1,000 years.
Absolutely, but also there were so many artificial interventions into the structure of the society. And now we're speaking about the 20th century, about times of Stalin, when Ukrainians were taking from them was the language was taken out, and it was very intendedly that Soviet regime was doing in Ukraine, because what language means for the nation, it's the DNA of the nations. If you take out the language, you kill the nation. And it was the strategy of Stalin to not allow Ukrainians to use the language and to stop, or for if unforeseen, to avoid any deliberation or sovereign movements from our sides.
No, absolutely. That was the tactic across the board. They did that the same with the ethnic Germans from the Volga region. Those they didn't send to concentration camps. It's pretty crazy. But a lot of Ukrainians did manage to escape the Holodomor and the collectivization in the 30s, and a lot of them went to Canada, and they made a huge contribution to Canada's agricultural sector. They went there and helped make Canada a breadbasket, growing wheat and many other things. Are there still? I realize you're posted here in South Africa, but you've been a diplomat for some time. Are you aware? Are there still strong ties between Ukrainians in Canada, for instance, and Ukraine?
That's a very interesting question, and you know that my first posting as a diplomat was to Canada, to Ottawa.
I knew that. I was pretending I did.
So it was 2004, 2007. Interestingly, when I went there, I was not even able properly to speak Ukrainian, and that's how Ukrainian community in Canada stimulated me, because I was so ashamed. I'm coming from Odessa, from traditionally Russian speaking, and I am at that age that I partly belong to USSR, and then this transformational period when sometimes we even didn't have books in Ukrainian. So yeah, I was.
Your Ukrainian was
rusty. Yeah, I was doing a lot of efforts that I really can speak proper Ukrainian to those people whom I respected so much, because being in several generations, they were keeping knowing Ukrainian language.
It's impressive.
And they were going back to Ukraine. There are several, we call it waves of migration from Ukraine to Canada, and definitely the very first one belongs to the years of collectivization and Holodomor. So we're speaking about 1932, 1933. And then afterwards, there was the next. So as of today, we can see already the fourth, or maybe with the invasion, the fifth wave. But interestingly, the elder generation was giving a lot of knowledge about Ukraine and Ukrainian language to the children. And I was very touched when, I think it was 1 year ago, the Parliament of Canada came for the sitting on the 24th of August for our Independence Day in Ukrainian Vyshyvankas. And a lot of those people have in their blood Ukrainian blood as well.
No doubt. No, it's an interesting interesting path of history. It's unfortunate people had to leave their home and settle elsewhere, but it does keep those strong ties. For instance, between Canada and between Ukraine. I suspect that those ties are probably strong because we've had Ukrainians come to America, but they tend to blend in, if I'm not mistaken.
I think that more than 1 million Ukrainians live out of the country, lived before the invasion
Yes.
started. Now,
Different now, yes. The
yeah.
number is difficult to estimate now. Yeah, we have to take everything from before the invasion, work with that. So one of the things I've always liked is the flag. I mean, the flag reminds me of Sweden's flag. It's similar colors, that gold and blue. It's a wonderful thing. It's amazing. You see that symbol everywhere. Rugby pitches all over the world now because people are paying attention. And the support from people around the world, I suppose, I hope is giving comfort to Ukrainians in some way.
Um, it is important. We were receiving that support even in South Africa when invasion started. The city hall of Cape Town was colored in blue and yellow, and one could think what it means for the people who are sitting in the shelters under missile attacks. Uh, but it matters when this person sitting in Ukraine and suffering, having access to different social media, is opening the phone and seeing that people are not indifferent. Governments can take different positions, but when people show solidarity, that means and that gives us a hope that the world will survive.
Now, as a diplomat, of course, I've worked in many embassies in Africa. We've talked about that, my experience with the diplomatic corps. Ambassadors have quite a job, regardless of where you're at, which posting. What's it been like? I mean, in the middle of a conflict as an ambassador, I mean, the normal communication you have back with Ukraine, is it still as strong as ever, or are they distracted by events? Does it make it more challenging to do diplomacy here in South Africa? Or is your focus less on communicating back home and more communicating with South Africans and the embassies here?
No, we have very strong coordination with the center. I think that it's mobilized and united the ministry itself
I see.
even more than ever. It showed the weakened places, and we were able to very quickly work on them and show our strengths as well. We were able to eliminate the things that are not needed in the communication and maybe sometimes to become more operative,
More effective, more efficient.
more efficient.
Okay, so that's interesting. So the conflict is, I mean, there's never anything good from a conflict. Nothing comes good from it. But as a consequence of the conflict, the way that you do business is probably improved, become more
There are two
efficient.
sides of it,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah.
So in terms of working here as a diplomat, because the scope, the size of the conflict, of the damage, and of the consequences is so huge, it cannot be just the any other conflict in the world that you just put the statement and blame or not blame or to call on the sides to come to the table of negotiations. It's different, and it put the ambassadors of Ukraine in the world to the different position, different level, and also it pushed us to use different tactics, maybe beyond diplomacy, because when your country is fighting not only for self survival, but for the survival of values of all the world, and you really understand that. then I believe, as representative, highest representative of this country, you have right to talk to the world, to talk to the governments, to explain this, and to deliver your position of your country on a little bit more intensified manner.
Yeah, okay, I got that. That makes sense. So let's go back before the conflict, okay, before we wrap up. And I want to go back so that people understand. I don't think people understand what an ambassador does. You have in our, I don't know if you do the same thing, but of course, you know that the one person is appointed, they present their credentials to the ministry, and you're accepted as a representative of that country. So in our case, when the ambassador is not available, we have a charge d'affaires, probably something similar. So someone steps in, but they're not the ambassador, and people confuse that. The ambassador has a very specific mission. So let's go back before the conflict. And what was the nature of your responsibility? Because I know what American ambassadors do in our missions in different countries. It's pretty consistent. Some places there's more of a focus on security and cooperation. Other places it's humanitarian assistance or development. Other places it's trade. So for you, my guess would be that Ukraine would be focused before the conflict on trade with South Africa, building trade ties, and then also probably some cultural exchanges. And then I think that a lot of South Africans like to go to university in Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe that's also part of it. So if you can, what would your focus have been before the conflict? Obviously, it's changed a bit now.
Every ambassador in the world has the same capacities, responsibilities, and tools. And being representative of the president of your country and of the government of your country, you are basically the small government operating in all the fields on the ground.
Mhm.
The difference with Embassy of Ukraine in South Africa is that this is the only Ukrainian embassy that is covering 10 countries in the same
Ooh.
time.
So you've got all of Southern Africa.
Yeah.
And
including Madagascar and Mauritius.
and did you have to go present your credentials in each of those countries?
Yet to Botswana and Mozambique.
But you have to. That's so you got to make the journey to do that.
Yeah, sure. So it's not only to present credentials, but it's also to represent
Sure.
every layer of your country, every layer of cooperation with that particular countries.
That must be a big challenge.
Traditionally, it is a challenge, but it's always easier maybe to work somewhere where it's not really well established.
Mhm.
When you are the first runner, when you are
You putting that first shovel in the ground, breaking new ground.
so it's challenging, but it's very inspiring. So we are very excited. We've been very excited. We had a challenge to put Ukraine on the map of these countries because it is traditionally perceived as the part of USSR still.
Sure.
And as you properly said in the beginning, oh, where is Ukraine? Who could find it? What Putin didn't know, that he will help us to put Ukraine on the map of this country.
Well, he certainly did that. He also pushed Sweden and Finland into NATO's arms.
A lot of mistakes, so he is the master of planning. But definitely today it's becoming more intense.
Mhm.
And before, as I told, we had traditional things that were happening between the countries as education, because a lot of people from these countries were studying during USSR times then in independent Ukraine. Scientific preparation,
okay.
it's something that goes beyond the borders. And sometimes embassy even doesn't know about the projects that are happening because the professors from different sectors, they are cooperating on different platforms,
Mhm.
like international ones. And this cooperation is happening and has been, like Ukrainians and South Africans having joint projects in research of Arctic
Mhm.
and biological projects there. So it's always been there. Trade and economy, it was very fluid. Sometimes it was big numbers that we had in trade. Sometimes it was smaller. After the war started in Ukraine, Russia annexed Crimea, and Russia already started invasion in Donbass in 2014.
Mhm.
The things became even more difficult in terms of trade and economy because
Well, when they
the
occupied
news are
Crimea
coming
too.
from, yeah, the picture of the country having that kind of conflict with a bigger neighbor is not stimulating.
No, it's not. It's not. It's not something that people want to get involved in. They want to stay away from it as much as possible. It's understandable.
And of course, there is a political touch on that,
Sure.
which also doesn't stimulate in this part of the world our relations. Now it's different, but it's more complicated because we are not altogether looking at what is going to happen after the
When the
war
war's
is
over,
over.
yeah.
And I think that this is my very important responsibility to build or keep these bridges of cooperation, communication, and to allow in the future our countries to boost our development through joint project because Ukraine definitely will be the hub of international investments.
Well, there's certainly a lot of reconstruction that have to be done, and rebuilding of infrastructure and housing and ports and roads and everything. So that's going to be a huge undertaking. It's interesting that you mention that because oftentimes political leaders focus on now and not what comes next. And we saw that, at least the public's perception was we saw that in Iraq because the U.S. finished the conflict and then what comes next. There actually was a plan, it just wasn't followed. It was a very detailed plan. For some reason, my government didn't follow the plan that they put together. But that is interesting. So that's kind of. Now you did say that you've not yet had an opportunity to go to Botswana. What was the other country?
Mozambique.
Mozambique. So let me guess. So South Africa, Lesotho, Swaziland, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Zambia, Namibia, Angola?
No, not
Malawi.
Angola, not Malawi, Madagascar, and Mauritius.
Oh, so you get to go out to the islands. Yeah, you've been to Mauritius already, I see. No, you haven't?
No,
Oh,
for
shame.
all this is because from the point of view of protocol, I didn't present credentials yet, and official visit cannot be done.
Until you done
So I don't travel.
Okay.
With having 10 countries, I don't even go on vacations.
Wow,
So
I
I'm
can
not
imagine.
I'm not traveling just for fun. If I go precisely for the matter.
Well, I'm not a beach person, so I wouldn't go to Mauritius for beaches. I prefer the mountains and the forest myself. But yeah, no, so Mauritius and Madagascar as well. That's quite a portfolio you've got there. So let me ask this question, then we'll wrap up if it's okay. What has been the most rewarding aspect of this posting for you here in South Africa? What has been the most rewarding thing? If I put you on the spot, my apologies. That's a question people don't
I
ask.
just think because every day is so different, and you're trying to put the very high goals and to achieve more. I didn't come here as ambassador.
Mhm.
I came as number two, as counselor on political issues. And probably the achievement was that through the work that I was trying to do and trying to build this bridge between Ukraine and South Africa and other countries, that I was noticed and that the President Zelensky decided to appoint me as ambassador, to upgrade me. It was not expected even by me. Now I will not be proud yet of any achievements unless the war is over. But yeah, we're doing a lot to raise awareness, to get support and assistance as much as we can get from that far and from this country that also is suffering through a lot of economic challenges and some natural catastrophes as we've seen in
The floods in
Brazil.
Brazil.
Meantime, we are trying to do where we are with what we have.
Well, that's brilliant. Ambassador, it's a pleasure to have you once again, and it's a special treat to actually be able to sit down with you in person. I mean, Zoom is one thing, but it's not the same, is it? It's not the same as meeting somebody. So thank you so much for your
Thank
time,
you.
and God bless.
Thanks.
Let me shut it down. We're still live.